Joining us on a very special public affairs show. Today we're actually featuring and discussing the issues of veterans. Did you realize that today there are over 30 million veterans in the United States today? We have a very special guest, Professor Gerson from the University of Massachusetts Lowell in the Political Science Department. Thank you for joining us.
Sure, thanks for having me.
And then, in addition, we also have two University of Massachusetts Lowell students. We have Lacey Diorio. Lacey?
Hi, how are you?
Thanks for coming back on.
Thank you.
We understand you're going to be graduating soon.
I will, finally. Excited.
And we also have, for our interviewer, Ashlyn Grady. Ashlyn?
Hi. Thanks for having me back.
So, Professor Gerson, I wanted to start off the round of questions with, since there are millions of veterans in the country today, can you tell us a little bit about how they have become ingrained in U.S. history and part of the U.S. culture?
Well, I see veterans as victims a lot of the times of wars. I know that we're very quick in our country to send young men and women off to fight with much celebration and ballyhoo, but then when those soldiers return home, oftentimes they're forgotten and are sort of cast aside, especially if there's an unpopular war, as we had with the Vietnam War. Those veterans came home to much scorn and were not welcomed as heroes as others were. And we could see today that many of the veterans are living troubled lives, whether it's dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder or homelessness. So while on the one hand we love our veterans, on the other I'm not sure if we take care of them as much as they deserve to be taken care of.
How do you think that the community can fix that and take better care of their veterans when they come home?
Well, thanks to the expose that was done recently at the Walter Reed Army Hospital, when some journalists came in and saw the deplorable conditions that were there, that led Congress to quickly hold hearings and try and hold people accountable and clean up the conditions there for the veterans. So one thing we could do is pay more attention to the facilities that veterans have to use when they come home. In this war in particular, many of the veterans are suffering from brain trauma, from the explosive devices that have been used by the guerrillas fighting them. And frankly, the Veterans Administration was not fully prepared for what they now have to deal with. So one way is we could have the best services, best medical care that money can buy, given that veterans have put their lives on the line for their country.
Ashley?
Do you find any major differences in the benefits that Vietnam veterans have as opposed to those that are coming back from Iraq today?
I think with each successive generation of veterans, the lobbying that veterans groups do, and they're a very strong force in Washington, has made it a little bit easier for the next group of veterans. Number of employees, the budget of the Veterans Administration has continued to expand, I think in part in response to demands that are coming from the veterans organizations. Prior to the GI Bill of Rights, which was offered to World War II veterans, where they're able to get low interest loans for homes and starting small businesses. Prior to that, veterans in America had it very tough. In fact, there's a famous march that took place in Washington called the Bonus March, or the Bonus Army in 1930. World War I veterans marched on their own government because they weren't given the pensions that were promised to them. And their encampment in Washington was brutally destroyed, and their movement put down by none other than General Douglas MacArthur, who would then become a hero of the Second World War. So veterans who've been fighting for their rights often do not get them themselves, but the next generation benefited, just as the World War I vets led to benefits for the World War II vets.
Could you talk a little bit about the GI Bill, and since you're talking about the benefits, I mean, are the veterans today, do they have the same benefits under the GI Bill, or?
I don't think they're quite as extensive as they were for the World War II veterans, and I'll give you an example of this. One of the recruitment tools that the military uses to lure young people to service is that they will have their education paid for. Mm-hmm. And I believe, depending on your service, that may be the case, but in one interview I did with a student of mine who's a veteran of the current war in Iraq in the Marine Corps, he came home to find that the Marine Corps will only pay for tuition and not fees. And as we know in the Umass system, 80% of the cost is the fees. So if he had expressly joined up so that he could have his higher education taken care of, mm-hmm. he would today be in for a rude awakening that most of his costs of education would not be paid for by his service. But he thought it varied depending on where you did your service.
Lindsay?
Now you teach political science, so mm-hmm. How do your classes connect with veteran issues in the war today?
Well, we start off the Intro to American Politics class talking about the sort of the founding of the Republic and looking at the debates around the Constitution. And one of the more interesting struggles that took place at the time that the Articles of Confederation were in effect, which was the first Constitution before the U.S. Constitution was ratified, was returning veterans from the Revolutionary War who, like the World War I vets, had been promised that they would be paid at a future date, were never actually paid. So they returned home to their farms in places like Massachusetts to find them in disarray because they had gone off and fought in the war for a number of years. And as soon as they return home, they get a knock on the door from the tax collector and the bankers saying, we know you went off to war, we're all in hard times right now, but we have to pay our debts, so you have to pay your debts. And on top of that, here's a tax bill for the money that you owe us. To which the veterans of the Revolutionary War said, how could you possibly ask us to pay such a debt? We just sacrificed, put our lives on the line. Nevertheless, the tax collectors came, and the soldiers joined together in bands to form their own militia. In Massachusetts, the revolt was known as Shays' Rebellion. It was led by Captain Daniel Shay from Pelham, Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. And they took up arms against the tax collectors and the state, saying, over our dead bodies, you're going to reclaim and mortgage our farm. And they were about to attack the Springfield Armory for a larger escalation against the state when the militia from Boston, supported by the bankers in Boston, marched out and crushed them and hung a number of their leaders. Shays luckily was able to escape to Vermont, but that was the way we treated our Revolutionary War heroes, by sending them to debtors' prisons or meeting a worse fate.
But it's not like that anymore.
No, you can just declare bankruptcy right now and have a hard time getting back the